In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, words are weapons. Every phrase, every sentence carries the weight of nations. And sometimes, one phrase can change the course of history. On a tense day in international relations, former President Donald J. Trump addressed the President of China in words that shocked the world. "Shut your mouth." A phrase simple in its construction, yet explosive in its implications. But to understand the gravity of this statement, we must travel back in time, through decades of U.S.-China relations, trade wars, diplomatic tension, and personal dynamics between two of the most powerful leaders of the 21st century. China's rise on the global stage did not happen overnight. For decades, the United States viewed China through a prism of economic opportunity, strategic rivalry, and cautious diplomacy. From the opening of relations under President Nixon in 1972 to the handshakes of the Clinton era, the U.S.-China relationship has always been a delicate balancing act. China's rapid industrialization in the 1990s and 2000s brought both admiration and apprehension. With a booming economy, an expanding military, and a global strategy that sought influence across Asia, Africa, and Europe, China was no longer a distant player. It had become a dominant force. Meanwhile, U.S. administrations oscillated between engagement and confrontation, carefully negotiating trade agreements while monitoring China's ambitions in the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the global tech market. By the time Donald Trump took office in 2017, decades of unresolved tension had reached a boiling point. Donald Trump, a businessman turned president, brought a new style to diplomacy: brash, direct, and unfiltered. Unlike traditional diplomats who rely on nuance and subtlety, Trump's approach was confrontational, transactional, and often provocative. To Trump, international relations were a negotiation, a zero-sum game. He saw trade imbalances, intellectual property theft, and military expansion as threats that required bold action. And nowhere was this more apparent than in his dealings with China. From imposing tariffs to publicly criticizing Chinese leaders, Trump signaled that the era of polite diplomacy was over. Every tweet, every press statement, and every phone call carried the potential to escalate tensions or make history. The phrase, "shut your mouth," did not emerge in a vacuum. It came at a time of extraordinary tension between Washington and Beijing. Trade negotiations had stalled, global supply chains were disrupted, and both nations were positioning themselves for influence in an increasingly multipolar world. Trump had repeatedly accused China of unfair trade practices. He criticized intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and what he called the longest-running robbery in history. Meanwhile, the Chinese government responded with tariffs, countermeasures, and sharp rhetoric. Into this tense environment came a series of private meetings and phone calls. According to multiple reports from U.S. officials, Trump was frustrated with the pace and tone of negotiations. In a moment captured by insiders, the president reportedly told President Xi Jinping, directly and without hesitation, "Shut your mouth." What did this statement mean? Was it a personal insult, a negotiation tactic, or a signal to the world that the United States would no longer tolerate what Trump saw as Chinese overreach? The world watched in shock. Diplomats in Beijing called emergency meetings, while Washington officials scrambled to manage fallout. Headlines around the globe questioned whether international norms had been breached. For allies in Europe and Asia, it was a moment of uncertainty. For markets, it was a moment of volatility. And for China, it was a test of composure and strategy. Xi Jinping, known for his calm and calculated approach, did not respond publicly in the same way. But behind closed doors, China's leadership debated how to respond, whether to escalate, de-escalate, or signal strength silently. Beyond the personal clash, this moment symbolized a broader struggle for global influence. The United States, long the dominant superpower, was asserting itself against a rising China. Trade wars escalated. Tech bans were imposed. Military posturing increased. Economists warned of a potential global recession. Businesses with supply chains tied to China faced uncertainty. Politically, Trump's base celebrated the directness, while critics argued that diplomacy required subtlety and caution. In retrospect, the phrase "shut your mouth" became emblematic of Trump's foreign policy: unorthodox, aggressive, and unapologetically personal. This is just the beginning of the story. What followed were months of tense negotiations, global market volatility, and public posturing by two of the most powerful nations in history. The phrase, though simple, represented a turning point, an inflection in U.S.-China relations that would reverberate across the world. In the next chapter, we will examine the immediate aftermath, the trade battles, the military maneuvering, and the behind-the-scenes diplomacy that defined the Trump-Xi era. We will uncover how one phrase reshaped negotiations, influenced global markets, and tested the boundaries of international protocol. When words collide with geopolitics, they often ignite consequences far beyond the chamber in which they were spoken. The phrase, "shut your mouth," spoken by President Donald Trump to President Xi Jinping, became a spark that would ignite a global fire of trade disputes, economic uncertainty, and diplomatic maneuvering. In this chapter, we explore how a single moment of confrontation transformed U.S.-China relations, reshaped global trade, and tested the resilience of economies worldwide. The tension that culminated in Trump's blunt remark was rooted in decades of perceived economic imbalance. The United States, with its massive consumption-driven economy, had long depended on Chinese manufacturing. Meanwhile, China amassed trade surpluses and strategically expanded its influence through infrastructure, technology, and global investment. Trump viewed this imbalance as not just an economic issue, but a national security threat. Within weeks of his statement, the U.S. administration escalated tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. These were not ordinary trade adjustments. They were carefully calculated economic weapons. China, in turn, responded swiftly. Tariffs were imposed on American agricultural products, technology goods, and raw materials. Both nations entered a cycle of escalation, each step more punitive than the last. Experts warned that this trade war was unlike any other in history. It was not just about economics. It was a battle for global technological dominance, control over supply chains, and strategic leverage in Asia-Pacific and beyond. The immediate effects of the trade war were felt across the globe. U.S. manufacturers faced rising costs, farmers lost export markets, and multinational companies scrambled to diversify supply chains. China, too, felt the pain. Its exports declined, domestic growth slowed, and global investors watched with increasing caution. Stock markets plunged as the uncertainty of the Trump-Xi confrontation reverberated from New York to Shanghai. But the story does not end with economics. The trade war revealed the interconnectedness of the modern global economy. Even nations not directly involved, Germany, India, Japan, felt tremors as supply chains shifted and commodity prices fluctuated. Analysts described the situation as a geopolitical earthquake, triggered by a single, unfiltered expression of frustration in a private diplomatic setting. While the world watched headlines, negotiations continued behind closed doors. The US and China conducted a series of high-stakes meetings, phone calls, and back-channel discussions. Here, the true weight of Trump's words became evident. Diplomats reported a tense atmosphere. Every concession was measured, every phrase dissected. According to insider accounts, Trump's blunt style forced Chinese officials to recalibrate their approach, carefully balancing face-saving rhetoric with the need to protect economic interests. These negotiations, often described as brutal chess matches, were punctuated by threats, ultimatums, and ultimatums delivered with unparalleled directness. It was a new form of diplomacy, one that relied on shock, surprise, and psychological pressure as much as traditional negotiation tactics. Economics alone did not define the confrontation. Military posturing played a central role in signaling resolve. The U.S. increased freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, while China conducted exercises near Taiwan and deployed advanced missile systems in contested regions. Trump's statement, perceived as a direct challenge, was echoed in the military domain. U.S. naval movements, arms sales to Taiwan, and high-level defense briefings all sent a clear message. America would assert its influence by any means necessary. China, adhering to its doctrine of strategic patience, responded with controlled demonstrations of strength. State media emphasized sovereignty, while commanders increased readiness without provoking direct confrontation. Analysts called this an unprecedented era of economic military hybridity, where tariffs, sanctions, and speeches were as potent as ships and missiles. The trade war and public confrontation had ripple effects across international politics. Allies of the U.S. expressed concern over unpredictability, while adversaries watched for opportunities to expand influence. In Europe, leaders urged caution and multilateral solutions. In Asia, nations reassessed supply chains and defense strategies. Even Russia, historically neutral in trade disputes, began positioning itself as a potential intermediary in global economic negotiations. The statement, simple yet explosive, highlighted a growing reality: that words, when wielded by leaders of superpowers, are not merely symbolic. They are tools of strategy, capable of reshaping alliances, markets, and national policies. At home, Trump's supporters lauded his directness. In rallies and media appearances, they celebrated the uncompromising stance against China, framing it as a reclaiming of American strength. Opponents, however, warned of reckless behavior. Critics argued that such blunt language and aggressive tactics risked economic backlash, diplomatic isolation, and long-term strategic instability. Public opinion polls reflected the polarization. Americans were divided between admiration for Trump's toughness and fear of the consequences of a trade war spiraling out of control. Perhaps the most enduring impact of this confrontation was in technology. The United States imposed restrictions on Chinese tech giants, citing national security threats. Companies like Huawei and ZTE faced bans, export restrictions, and heightened scrutiny. China responded with accelerated domestic innovation, investments in semiconductors, and strategic partnerships across Asia and Europe. The trade war, initially about tariffs, evolved into a competition for technological supremacy, a battle for control of the future digital economy. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the phrase "shut your mouth" had transcended personal insult. It had triggered a series of events that reshaped global trade, military strategy, and political alliances. In the next chapter, we will explore the critical turning points, the tense summits, the near-crises moments, and the strategic decisions that brought the world to the edge of economic and military confrontation. We will uncover the human, political, and economic consequences of one simple phrase and how it continues to echo in international relations today. In international diplomacy, summits are more than meetings. They are the stages on which history unfolds. When two superpowers face off, every handshake, every nod, every word is scrutinized. And when President Donald J. Trump and President Xi Jinping met after the infamous phrase, "Shut your mouth," the world held its breath. These were not ordinary summits. They were battlegrounds of ideology, strategy, and power. Here, the tensions that had simmered in trade wars, tariffs, and military maneuvers came to a boiling point. In the weeks leading up to the summit, both administrations worked feverishly behind the scenes. Policy advisors, diplomats, military strategists, and economic experts convened in closed rooms, crafting positions, contingency plans, and talking points. Trump's team emphasized a tough stance, highlighting trade imbalances, intellectual property concerns, and national security issues. Their message was clear: America would not back down. Meanwhile, China's leadership focused on stability, face-saving measures, and strategic messaging. Xi Jinping, known for his composed demeanor, planned to counter Trump's unpredictability with careful calculation. The stage was set for a summit that could either de-escalate tensions or accelerate the path toward crisis. When the two leaders finally met, their styles could not have been more different. Trump, brash, direct, and unconstrained by protocol. Xi, composed, strategic, and measured. According to insiders, the summit began cordially but quickly moved into contentious territory. Discussions on tariffs, technology, and military maneuvers were marked by interruptions, pointed questions, and uncompromising positions. At one critical moment, frustration boiled over. Trump, exasperated by perceived delays and evasions, reportedly leaned forward and delivered the now famous phrase in private discussions, "Shut your mouth." A simple statement, yet one that resonated far beyond the room. The phrase was more than a personal insult, it was a calculated tactic. Trump aimed to assert dominance, signal seriousness, and disrupt traditional diplomatic norms. Xi, while outwardly composed, was forced to recalibrate the Chinese approach in real time. The immediate diplomatic fallout was profound. While no official statement acknowledged the words publicly, the implications were clear to diplomats worldwide. Allies of both nations observed carefully. European leaders urged calm and multilateral solutions. Asian nations recalculated regional strategies. Even Russia and India analyzed the statement for its broader geopolitical implications. Within both nations, political reactions were mixed. In the United States, Trump's base hailed the boldness. Critics warned that such unfiltered language risked diplomatic isolation and further economic instability. In China, state media avoided repeating the phrase, but emphasized the importance of dignity, sovereignty, and national pride. Behind the scenes, intense discussions focused on whether to retaliate, compromise, or pursue a strategic long game. Despite the confrontation, the summit produced a series of agreements, conditional, tentative, and heavily scrutinized. Tariff reductions were negotiated, albeit with staggered implementation. Commitments on intellectual property were vague, leaving room for interpretation. And technology transfer disputes were deferred, reflecting the complexity of the issues at hand. Observers noted that these agreements were fragile. They relied on continued negotiation, trust, an elusive commodity between two leaders known for strategic assertiveness. Analysts compared the summit to a high-stakes game of poker, where each side revealed only what was necessary, keeping their ultimate intentions hidden. Even as summit agreements were signed, global markets responded with a mixture of optimism and caution. Stock indices fluctuated, commodity prices shifted, and currency markets experienced volatility. Companies with supply chains tied to China faced uncertainty. Investors analyzed not only what was agreed upon, but what was left unsaid. One phrase, uttered privately, had become a catalyst for global economic attention. The lesson was clear. In an interconnected world, diplomatic rhetoric can move markets as powerfully as economic policy. Behind closed doors, both leaders conducted complex calculations. Trump aimed to maintain leverage, signaling strength to both domestic and international audiences. Xi focused on preserving China's long-term strategic goals, balancing retaliation with the need to avoid escalation. Military analysts noted that while words were exchanged, both nations increased alert levels. Naval movements, cyber monitoring, and intelligence operations continued, underscoring the high stakes. For Xi, the phrase, "shut your mouth," was both a challenge and a warning that America under Trump was willing to break conventional norms and that strategic patience alone might not suffice. At the heart of the summit was a human drama. Trump's personality, direct, confrontational, and media-savvy, clashed with Xi's composed, disciplined, and strategic style. Historians later noted that the encounter revealed the impact of leadership personality on global affairs. Words, tone, and demeanor were as influential as policy positions. One phrase, simple in its language, carried immense strategic weight. The summit illustrated that diplomacy is not only about agreements, but about perception, psychology, and signaling, especially when the world's most powerful leaders are involved. By the end of the summit, tensions had not dissipated. Agreements were in place, but underlying conflicts remained unresolved. The phrase, "shut your mouth," had become emblematic of the larger struggle, a clash of power, ambition, and national interest. In the next chapter, we will explore the moments when global crisis loomed, the near confrontations, the high-stakes negotiations, and the precarious balancing act that defined U.S.-China relations during this period. We will examine how diplomacy, strategy, and human personality intersected on the world stage, shaping the future of two nations and the global order.